let's talk about the economic impact for 2000, or excuse me, the outlook for 2014. And it's it's very interesting. We're kind of at a crossroads, so to speak. It's going to be an interesting year. There's some interesting events, and you see here this picture, and I think it represents kind of the outlook for 2014. It is also indicative of what happened in 2013. You see a plow horse and not a racehorse, and I've alluded that in several different settings that our economy used to be going at 5 to 8% growth rate every year, and so we were living in Lake Wobegon, and people were pretty happy and making some money, and the investments were realizing some great returns, and so one thing about being a plow horse economy though is that it's slow and steady, and when you're running fast like a thoroughbred, there's all kinds of things can happen. But in a plow horse that's plodding along, and you've got something that's a little more steady. And I think if we look back on 2013, it kind of characterizes what we had gone through. We had sequestration that Congress implemented because they couldn't agree on some specific spending cuts. So sequestration went into effect, and that meant we're spending less money as a government and injecting funds into the economy. And we also had the end of the 2-year payroll tax holiday, and so everybody's income went down by about 2% towards the first of the year of 2013. So that was a little bit of a drag on the economy. Of course, the political gridlock just ridiculous, and that's kind of my personal feeling about it, but I think many of you share that viewpoint. And a lot of that gridlock, of course, resulted into a partial shutdown of the government back in October, and that cost us a little bit of a hit on our economy. But ultimately, there was a continuing resolution, a kicking of the can down the road, so to speak, that basically extended the federal budget through January 15, but it did leave the sequestration cuts in place. But it did, importantly, provide at least a short-term fix for the debt ceiling issue. And again, we kicked that can down the road, and so in February we'll have to address that. One of the things about 2013 that I thought was really positive was that state and local governments were faring much better. They had took it on the chin during the bulk of the Great Recession and the aftermath, but there was renewed fiscal strength, and we saw a lot of municipalities hiring more police and fire and teachers and so forth, and actually a few pay raises across the country. Now, the Detroits of the world are still suffering and behind the 8 ball, but there were a number, I think 2/3 of the top 100 state and local municipalities across the country showed double-digit growth last year, so that was pretty good. And the other big thing is that the world didn't fall apart in terms of the European Union and the Middle East, and so we were spared a lot of the drag on the world economy and thus our economy because of that. So let's look at some of the macroeconomic drivers going into 2014. But first, let me address a few key dates. I said 2014 is going to be interesting, and it sure is because of a number of these things. Of course, on January 28th, the president's going to be delivering his State of the Union address. And you say, "Why in the world, Charlie, would you talk about that?" Well, it kind of gives an indication of how the administration is posturing for the coming year, and that can have an influence, at least short-term, on short-term markets. So we've got to be interested in that. I personally think the president will take a little different approach in his State of the Union address this time, and not put so much emphasis on exports, because those really haven't played out as much as he'd liked, and except for, ironically, petroleum exports. And we're rocking and rolling in terms of our petroleum industry in the Bakken region of North Dakota and here in Texas, the oil production. So we're exporting a lot of oil. Tremendous difference from our picture the energy industry from a decade ago. So that's interesting in and of itself. Now you've got that next bullet there. It says March question mark, and you notice I didn't put February 7th as the debt ceiling deadline because the Treasury can always play a few games, and those games that they rob Peter and pay Paul and pay somebody first and delays the other payments and so forth. And so really it's going to be about March when that debt ceiling really hits us over the head, and we're going to have to address that, and we got to address that between now and then. So we got to get busy. Another key date, March 19th. Of course, Janet Yellen will be taking over for Ben Bernanke in the Federal Reserve, and the president announced yesterday that more than likely Stanley Fischer will be vice chairman. So those are two very capable people, and I think personally Bernanke has done a stellar job given the fact that we've rewritten the economic textbooks over the last 8 years, and truly we were walking some new ground from a fiscal policy standpoint. But with a change of regime in the Federal Reserve, we're going to see kind of a different mindset, and the Federal Reserve has been injecting about $85 billion a month into the economy through purchasing and mortgage-backed securities and other long-term assets. So artificially, the Federal Reserve has kind of been bolstering the stock market, and we've been getting some gains because of that. And there's going to be some pulling back on the reins there. And back in the summer, even when there was a hint of the Federal Reserve pulling back on QE3, the stock markets went erratic for about two weeks. So we know that's going to happen at some point. But the good news is that it's usually a long and drawn-out process, and we're much healthier now than what we were 5 years ago. So that probably won't have too much of a drag on the economy. Now, March 31st is when the Affordable Care Act goes wide open across the country, across all sectors, and that's going to have a mixed impact. It may actually bolster the construction side of building, but and I'll talk about that in just a second. But it may have a drag on some of the business investment that goes on as well. Now, some of the Mideast talks are going to finalize in May. And, that's always an interesting dilemma, whether to talk about those kinds of things. I think it's a notable date to just be aware of and see how that plays out, because it could affect at least defense spending, and then that would have an impact on the economy. And then, of course, we got midterm elections coming up at the end of the year. And you're going to see a whole lot of posturing on the part of Democrats and Republicans, Tea Party, et cetera, that over the next several months, obviously, and particularly in discussing the debt ceiling coming up, you're going to see the Republicans take the proverbial debt ceiling hammer and try to lay out the Democrats with it. And that's just like every single regime has done since LBJ. So we're going to see a lot of political maneuvering, and so that's setting a stage there. Now, a couple of quick comments on the shutdown and the debt ceiling. The government shutdown cost us about $24 billion. Well, it doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it was a big hit, about 0.2, 0.6% hit on GDP. And, of course, we just ended up with a 4.1% increase in the third quarter last year, and that's the latest numbers of GDP. And it would have been even higher had we not had the government shutdown. And, again, you see the February 7 date there in that bullet, as far as the debt ceiling. But you see, notice that next bullet, 79 times. I put that in there just to remind myself to tell you that this raising the debt ceiling kind of plays out in the media as though it's something big. But you got to remember, since 1962, we've raised the debt ceiling 79 times. Now count them: 1, 2, 3, 4, all but 79 times. So when I talked about the proverbial hammer, that the party that's not in control beating the party that is control over the money that they're spending, that's what I'm talking about. And this is politics being played out. And so don't pay attention to that. That shouldn't affect your strategic mindset for your green industry business at all. And you're going to see some big numbers, 16.6 trillion as far as our total debt level. Well, trust me, that is a lot of dollars. All right, even if you started counting from here to a trillion, from right now, 1 to a trillion, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and assuming you could count one number for every second, it'd take you 32 years to count to a trillion. That's how many dollars we're talking about. I mean, we're talking serious dollars. But even at that, remember, our economy produces this much of economic contributions every single year. And so we shouldn't really pay attention to the total debt levels. And you see, I've crossed out. I struck out that bullet there, total debt. We shouldn't even pay attention to total debt levels to to the extent that we are. Instead, we should come up with a benchmark of something like debt to GDP, and then measure our performance relative to that benchmark. And right now, we're sitting at about 106, just shy of 107% of GDP. And of course, that's not sustainable over the long run, but that's varied from 32% when Reagan was in office to, I think, Clinton was in office when we were at 122% of GDP. But yet, and you see a lot of rhetoric on Facebook, et cetera, about, the federal government just acted like a household and we wouldn't see all this extra spending. Well, that's an erroneous comparison. A sovereign government is far, far different than a household budget. So don't play into that mindset. Plus, you got to remember, we owe 2/3 of that debt to ourselves. We've been borrowing against Social Security, et cetera, and so we're going to have to pay that back. But it's all comes down to demographics. Because people earn the most and save the most and pay more taxes between 45 and 55 years of age. And so boomers have been, filling the coffers for many, many years. Xers, with 11 million fewer of them, there are going to be fewer people in their major income earning years paying taxes. So the next decade to decade and a half is what we've got to get through, because when Gen Y gets into their major income earning years and tax paying years, we'll be filling the coffers again, because there's 84 million of those compared to 78 million boomers. So it's a timing issue. All right, so I'm deviating, so I gotta move on here, because we got a short time this morning. Now, this slide tells a lot of stuff right here. This is GDP versus employment. And you can see the numbers that we're producing more today than what we were prior to the recession. Now, let me even add to that caveat that we're producing more today than we've ever done in this country. I mean, there's some serious productivity that we've gone through. We're producing almost 6% more than what we were prior to the recession. But the red line there is unemployment or employment. And so we're producing almost 6% more with 2 million fewer people employed. Now that, my friends, is freaking amazing. And you ask, how did we do that? Well, we automated in some cases. We implemented automation, and we got busy. You think about those of you online, with the things that you had to do to survive the single greatest downturn in 80 years. I mean, we laid some people off, and sometimes we got out of the office and we got back in the field and we weeded and we did what it took, and that's what America has done, and it's depicted in this slide. So a lot of people talk about the jobs that are still left unfilled, but we've come a long way. So we shouldn't beat ourselves over the head too much. And those of you online are much to be thanked for that performance, because you can see that this is a breakdown of GDP, and the blue portion of each bar is personal consumption expenditures. So that's what you and I and everybody else is spending in terms of our GDP contributions, and it's been estimated from 67 to 70% of GDP is wrapped up in these personal consumption expenditures. So we need to keep spending, but we also need business investment. And interestingly, we only get a 2-to-1 economic return from every dollar that we spend as a consumer. But every dollar that you spend as a business in our economy, there's a 4-to-1 return. So there's a bigger bang for your dollar being invested into the economy, the payrolls that you make, and the goods and services that you make and subsequently sell. There's a greater economic impact from you than there is from personal consumption expenditures or even exports or government consumption. That's the green part and the purple part of these bars. And you can see during the recession, exports carried the day. And the trend was such that, the president made a promise that he was going to increase exports by 5-fold by the end of his 8 years. And so he's had to back off on that because other factors play into exports. And all the confusion that's gone through the European Union has made our goods and services more expensive on the world market. So we've seen a pulling back in terms of our exports. All right, let's talk about employment, the overall state of the economy. And you heard me say it before that if there's one index I would encourage you to look at every month, it'd be the leading economic index. And this is a foretelling of how the economy is going to be over the next 6 to 9 months. So you can see the slope of that blue line. That's the leading economic index. And that, my friends, is what's projected over the first half to 2/3 of 2014. It actually looks pretty good. Now, there's some of my colleagues, my economist colleagues, that are calling for a market correction long about summer. And they think that some of the QE3 and the easing of the tapering of the quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve has been involved in, that $85 billion I talked about, they're thinking that that's going to increase interest rates more than what's expected, and there's going to be a correction in the stock market. So we may see a correction there. We may not. We just have to see how that plays out. But if you look at the leading economic index, which is really those 10, that box there you see on the left, that's those 10 economic indicators all rolled into one. It's a weighted measure, and the Conference Board generates this, and it's pretty darn good as a leading index and showing us what's coming down the pike. Now, if you look at it on a state-by-state basis, those dark green states are the areas of the country which are expected to grow at a faster rate than those that are the lighter green. And then Idaho, my goodness, you're living in Idaho, it's like Lake Wobegon's going to move from Minnesota to Idaho. It's a really good projection in terms of the first half of 2014. All right, now the Chicago Fed, we've got all these branches of the Federal Reserve, and they specialize in different types of financial analyses. And the Chicago Fed puts out an indicator, it's called their National Activity Index, and it's a 3-month moving average. And all the situations, all the times that we're above that horizontal line, we are growing faster than the historical trend. So we're in that category right now. That's not always been the case since mid-2009 when the recovery started. But for right now, we're growing faster than the historical trend. Now, one thing I find comforting is Bloomberg's Financial Conditions Index. And when this is above 0, that means the financial stresses are less than what they would be otherwise. And this particular index has reached all-time high over the course of the last year. So that means that we're in a situation with less financial stress than we've had probably over the last decade. And it doesn't surprise me too much because banks have been hoarding money, and when there's cash out there, there's less financial stress, and there's been some implications of that. And you as green industry growers and service providers and retailers have paid a price to that somewhat because of the difficulty in getting more investment or debt capital injections into your business. All right, employment. Again, the media loves talking about employment. Anytime the jobs report is released, you always see about a week's worth of media attention placed on that report. And the Conference Board generates an employment trends index. You see at the upper left-hand side of this slide, you see an employment trends index, and it too is increasing. We're not back to where we were prior to the recession, obviously, because we got 2 million fewer jobs than what we did. There are 2 million fewer people employed. But that trend is very encouraging. And what's even more encouraging is that if you look at a 4-week running average of those that are filing for unemployment, you've got a situation where that's declining significantly. In fact, if you look at, we economists use a benchmark of about 400,000 jobs. So when unemployment claims are below this horizontal line right here, that means that we're basically creating more jobs in the country than we're losing. And we've been in that situation for a while now, so that's very encouraging. Now, housing. I'm going to take about 6 minutes here and just talk about housing, because this is the most correlated sector that if you look at the green industry sales, this is the part of the economy we're most correlated with. So this is the precipitous decline in housing starts that we show right here. And those that have heard me speak in person know that I joke around and I say this is the dead cat bouncing along the bottom. And I had a lady in Wisconsin, bless her heart, that she took exception to that. She was a cat lover, but if you drop a cat off the top of a building, how high does it bounce? About that far right there. So we've not had in the early aftermath of the Great Recession a lot of growth in housing starts. But look at this trend here. Towards the end of that red line, significant increase in 2012 to 2013. And in fact, housing starts last year increased 18%. We had about 923,000 starts. I just got the email a few minutes ago, and I was glad that I was hoping it would be released before 10 o'clock Central, and it was. So 923,000 starts in 2013, 18% increase over 2012. No one really expected that, so that's kind of interesting there. All right, next slide here. In fact, this is a last year's forecast. You remember I was online last year, and I was saying that most pundits are projecting between 900,000 and 1.1 million units, and this is where I got that data. Right, this is the housing forecast that everybody was coming up with, and of course, settling in at 923,000. There was a little bit of discrepancy there, but where people really missed the boat was on housing prices. And housing prices increased about 12% last year. Just phenomenal growth in housing prices. In fact, unsustainable growth in housing prices. And I've said on several occasions that the 1 or 2% appreciation in our home prices is a good thing, because if we got better too quickly, we would not have learned our lessons. So 12% gains in the housing prices, while I'm a homeowner, and from that standpoint I feel good about it, but from an economic standpoint, I know that we got to pay the piper at some point. So that 12% in home prices in 2013 is not sustainable, and we're not going to see that kind of growth over 2014. In fact, here's the Case-Shiller Home Price Index, and you can see since the end of the recession, the decline in home prices, and then we started increasing. Then we had the end of the first-time home buyer tax credit. So here we had a policy measure caused a decrease in the price of homes, and then we've climbed back from that. So we're not exactly made whole yet, but we're getting there. And of course, we don't build more homes until the supply of homes clears out the pipeline. In this particular chart that's produced by the St. Louis Federal Reserve, you can see that the supply of homes is down to about 4 or 5 months of homes that are left in that pipeline. It's like a retailer. Those of you on the line that are retailers, you don't buy more product and put it on the shelf until the product that's on the shelf gets sold. It's the same with houses. We don't build a lot more houses until the supply of homes that's already existing out there um, uh, gets cleared out the pipeline. Now, you can see some of the forecasts for 2014. And while the forecasts last year were optimistic and we settled in at 923,000 starts, now mind you, that's roughly half of where we were prior to the recession. And this year, again, the housing pundits are projecting about 1.1 million units across the board. Everybody's fairly similar in their projections, and they're a little less similar in terms of their housing price expectations. You can see it ranging from just shy of 3% up to a little over 6%. We'll see how that plays out, but the point being is that the housing sector looks pretty good, and as long as Congress doesn't mess things up early in the year, we should see some gains there. Now, those houses that aren't being built and sold and so forth are being remodeled. And this is a 4-quarter moving average of remodeling expenditures. And this is kind of a foretelling of the Lowe's, Depot, and Walmart market in terms of the expenditures people make in terms of improving their homes. And you can see early in the year here, we're looking at, double-digit growth rate in the home improvement market. Now, that's not a direct measure of flower, shrub, and tree sales, but it is a proxy measure because flower, shrubs, and trees and landscape installations represent a type of home improvement. So a proxy measure there, at least on sales in the box store side of the market, you're going to see those kinds of increases, and that typically is representative of the IGC market as well. So double-digit growth rate early in the year, falling off to, in the latter half of the year, just shy of double-digit growth rate. So again, some positives there. On the commercial side, we're still lagging a little bit. Any commercial project basically has an architect involved, and this index is kind of one of the best proxy measures of the commercial real estate market that I know of. And you can see the general, if you fit a trend line through this red line, it's generally going upward. And there's a 9 to 12 month lag behind the residential market. So all the positives I've been talking about for 2014 in terms of the residential market should play out to a very strong 2015 commercial real estate market. And those of you who may be on the maintenance side, the landscape maintenance side of the business, the latter half of 2015 looks, pretty darn good. Now, confidence, consumer confidence, and I've joked around before and said I won't go so far as saying that this particular indicator is totally useless, but I'll say this, that this particular indicator is totally useless. And the media loves it, and they talk about it all the time, and they get confused between the Michigan Index and the Conference Board Index. There's actually two of them, and they don't really talk about which one. But you can see that we as consumers, we in the aftermath of recession, which is this gray area right here pointed by my arrow, we feel good and we feel bad depending on what report is coming out in the media. Because we're a soundbite country, and that discourages me dadgummit to no end. I wish people knew enough to know the difference, but they don't, and they keep listening to too many sound bites. But you all do know enough to know the difference. So when you hear about gas prices, you got to recognize that even when gas prices were $4 a gallon and above, even for the families, lower income families, gasoline only represents about 3% of the household budget. So it's not a deal breaker. In fact, if you look at the number of miles driven, and that's in this slide here in the blue line, you can see we've been decreasing the number of miles driven, in fact, in spite of the fact that gasoline prices have been going down. Now, just in Montana last week, and gas was $2.93 a gallon. That is redonkulous. Here in Texas, we're about $3.30 and so forth. And in New Hampshire earlier in the week, it was roughly the same price. There's not a strong correlation between the number of miles that we drive and gasoline prices, and yet people talk about gasoline prices and the impact that has on consumer confidence. What does have an impact, though, I think, is our incomes and how our incomes are increasing. And the red line in this chart shows how the increase in income we've had, since the early 2000s, and that's a pretty marked increase. Now, that's the nominal growth that we've had. The blue line represents the real growth, that is adjusted for inflation. So if you account for inflation, incomes have gone up. You still fit a trend line here that's generally upward sloping, but not at quite the rate as the nominal growth. And of course, the good news there is that as income rises, expenditures rise. C. Northcote Parkinson was an economist of the last century that had this principle. Your income rises from $40,000 to $50,000. Somehow magically you find a way to spend that $10,000, and so that's good news. That in the past, whenever people's income increased, they spent more on flower, shrubs, and trees. But that, unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. The discretionary items, and that flower, shrubs, and trees and landscape services are part of those discretionary items because we haven't necessarily positioned ourselves as an essential item for the end consumer. We're a luxury that they can throw aside at a whim based off of the economic conditions or otherwise. This particular index here is produced by the Consumer Metrics Institute, and that blue line basically shows how likely consumers are to make discretionary purchases. You can see right now we're roughly 80% of where we were in 2005. So that means that consumers at large are about 80% as likely to make discretionary item purchases as they were back in 2005. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing that in our marketplace because, again, we're considered to be luxury items and we're not necessities, and we got to change that. All right, savings rate. Yeah, I won't spend a lot of time here. We don't save a lot in this country. All right, the boomers, particularly, we put our savings into our homes and our 401ks, and those 401ks became 101ks, and now they're 1.5 01ks, and so we're sitting right now just above 4% in terms of our savings rate. I'm more concerned with how we're spending our money, though, and these are personal consumption expenditures. And you can see before the gray area, this is the Great Recession that we went through into 2007 to mid-2009. This is what you and I and everybody else was spending to live: food, clothing, gas, shelter, health care, everything that we spend our money on. And this is where we were prior to the recession, where my arrow is, and you can see where we are now. I mean, we're spending considerably more dollars, and these are real dollars. This is adjusted for inflation. So we're truly comparing apples and apples and oranges and oranges. So we're spending more today than what we were prior to the recession. But we're not spending, according to the National Gardening Association data or any data you want to look at, we're not spending as much on flowers, shrubs, and trees and landscape services as what we were prior to the recession. So people have shifted expenditures away from what we're providing. That's the bottom line. They're not valuing us as much as they should. So I'm showing you right there. The consumption is more today than what it was prior to the recession. And you know what? I think there's some of you online and some of you across the country that could say, okay, my sales are higher than what they were prior to the Great Recession, but not everybody can say that. And unfortunately, the ones that can say that their sales are higher today than it were then, those are the exception to the rule rather than the rule. it goes down that people buy things that enhance the quality of their lives, and we've not convinced people that we're a necessity, as I said earlier. And I've got that one chart that I've used in several different presentations over the last year. This is U.S. pet expenditures. This is what we in Texas spend on our rattlesnakes and armadillos, and the rest of the country, that's what you spend on dogs and cats and birds and so forth. Well, this blue bar, the first bar in this chart right here, shows 2006 expenditures on our pets. And then 2007, and then 2008. I mean, we're in the full throes of the recession, and you can see the increases there. 2009, 2010, 2011 is a red bar. 12 was the increase. It's not shown in that graph. It also increased. And 13, the final data aren't in, but that's also projected to increase. There are very few sectors that show that kind of growth. And this is what we spend on our dadgum pets, our dogs and our cats. And so you got to ask yourself, why do we do that? Why do consumers do that? Why do they not value flowers, shrubs, and trees and landscapes to the point where they're spending those kind of dollars, those kind of trends on our industry? Now, that's what we've got an answer, folks, in our industry. Because in 2014, it's not the economy that's going to be the drag on our industry. It's the only dragging that's going to go on our industry is us dragging our feet and not making our value proposition in a more straightforward fashion, so that people view us as more than pretty. We got to sell the economic benefits, the environmental ecosystem services benefits, and the health and well-being benefits of what we do. And we're going to continue seeing some structural changes. One of my favorite newsletters I get every e-news blast from all the trade magazines, and I love keeping track of what's going on in the industry and the gossip, so to speak. But Ron Edmonds puts together a summary each month or so about the merger and acquisition activity, particularly in the landscape sector side. Ron does a great job with that, and the number of mergers and acquisitions in 2013 were phenomenal, particularly in the landscape sector. And we're going to see more of that merger and acquisition activity, more structural changes, more consolidation. We've heard over the last couple of weeks some major greenhouse businesses changing hands, and that's just that's the maturity stage of the life cycle in which we find ourselves. So we're going to continue seeing some consolidation because of that, and that's just the nature of the market in which we find ourselves. That is our reality now. All right, so I've gone exactly 42 minutes and 3 seconds, and so I'm going to pop over here to the questions box and open that up, and I'm going to see if there's any questions that I need to answer here. One person followed up on my statement earlier that the slides will be available. I think my next slide will show where it's on. It'll be on my Ellison Chair website in the multimedia section in the webinars. All right, so I got another question. Let me read it here. Short-term, increasing the debt ceiling will make things more comfortable for all of us, but long-term, how do we balance that against just perpetuating this current Ponzi scheme? I love it. I love it. And I'm asking in a truly economic way, not in a political way. Well, long-term, we've got to make sure that our tax revenues that we generate are enough to pay our debts, right? So but we can carry debt. Now, let me just go to a different little factoid here, is that since our country's existence, we've been in debt. Only 2 years have we not been in debt, and both of those situations have been followed up by depressions. So carrying debt is a natural part of a sovereign government who's providing public goods. That is, goods that everybody gets the benefit of, but fewer people are willing to pay the price for. And that entitlement mentality is becoming more and more exacerbated, and that's probably part of the issue. Now, the debt ceiling is only there. In fact, in my mind, we should do away with the debt ceiling altogether, right? And But because we're not going to do that because of the politics, then we need to come up with a better benchmarks than simply just a total debt level. And that's what I was saying earlier in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. All right, got another question here. Do you have a fuel forecast for the first half of 2014? Oh, you know what? I didn't take a look at that over the last week. I think the last time I looked, the projected average was going to be in the 325 to 330 range for 2014. But I'll tell you exactly where to find that information. You go to EIA.gov. Now, that's not EIEIO.gov. That's EIA, the Energy Information Agency.gov. All right, and they'll have the short-term gasoline forecast for the next 3 to 6 months and thereafter. So that's a good place to find that. All right. The question follow-up on pet expenditures, does that include medical expenses for pets or just products? That's a very good question. I don't know for sure, but I'm almost positive it does include the medical expenses. All right. Oh, yeah. Got another question here. I said the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, will bolster construction. And they were wanting some clarification. I forgot to mention that when I was talking about commercial real estate. Most are projecting that the visits to the emergency rooms just for your traditional health care are going to, that phenomena is going to go down, and there's going to be more demand for walk-in clinics and so forth. And so we don't have enough of those to satisfy the potential demand that's out there. So that's what most people are feeling. There's going to be some commercial real estate bolstering in that sector because they're going to want to build more healthcare facilities. So that's what that's all about. Any input or update on the Farm Bill? Stay tuned. That's a good one. The rhetoric is on the street is that we've got support for it, and that's another can we keep kicking down the road. And there's just a lot of things that are on the plates and are distracting folks. And we'll probably more continuing resolution short term, but we'll see how that plays. I don't really have a specific answer for you there. All right, so when you visit a garden center, what catches your attention? Pricing, display, colors, employees. Well, you know what? We've been doing some eye tracking in terms of some of the what is it that's drawing people's attention in the garden center, and Bridget Behe's been writing about some of that in Garden Center magazine. So I'll refer you to that in terms of what's catching folks' attention. Do you feel there's going to be major consolidation in the retail garden center segment and will involve new players that are only garden centers? Yeah, there's going to be some consolidation there. The internet is going to play an interesting role, but we don't have time to really talk about some of those implications. But most of the consolidation so far has been on the growing and the landscape service side, less so on the retail garden center segment. But most of the activity there has been departure from the retail garden center industry and those that are left. Do you think the feeling richer effect from the stock market rise will translate into more leisure spending on new landscapes from homeowners? You know what? Absolutely. And if you look back in the income slide, I didn't pay much attention to those call-out boxes, but when you go back and refer to the slides, you'll see that anytime we've had an injection of income, like the Microsoft dividends or the one-time payments from governments and so forth, only 21% of that is ever saved. 80% of it's spent. All right. So if the question then becomes, what are people spending the 80% of those dollars on? So yes, the short-term gains from stock market increases or any other phenomena, whether it be from the government or otherwise, does translate into more leisure spending. But we're no longer number one on the leisure time activity list. We're 9 or 10 on the list. People rather read books than garden or landscape now. Are you kidding me? Because people sure don't act like they read a whole lot of books. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, but you got my point. Let's see. What impact do you think pay by scan continues to have with growers? That's interesting. There are a few growers that have made that work quite successfully. There are others in which that has caused undue pressures on their business, and I think it may be economies of scale. And those that are large enough to basically go into 250 to 300 stores or even more have had enough market power to kind of push back against that particular box store that we're talking about, and others have not had the market power to push back, and therefore have been taken advantage of. So it's a very mixed type of phenomena. GDP forecast for 2014. Basically, we're going to see in the 3 to 5% range is what most people are projecting. They're seeing stronger growth, and we ended up in third quarter last year 4.1. Most people think it's going to be between 3 and 4% in the fourth quarter, and continue on into 2014. All right, what is happening in Idaho and New Jersey that's causing extreme growth? That's a very good question. That whole region of the country, I would expect it when you're referring to the leading economic indexes for the states. I would expect North Dakota to have been one of the faster growing states, because unemployment's less than 0.5% in North Dakota, and that whole oil production in North Dakota is revolutionized. In fact, if we could just move everybody that needs a job right now to North Dakota, well, unemployment would be going down from 6.8% to probably 5.5%. Of course, you got to live in North Dakota. No, my apologies to the North Dakotans, but I'm a Southern boy, so that's I think a lot of it's energy related. What advice do you have for graduates just entering the green or horticultural industry as employees or as new small business owners? Base everything off a value proposition that's more than pretty. Try cultivating that mindset right now, early on in your career, so that you're talking about the economic benefits and environmental ecosystem services benefits and the health and well-being benefits. Have that as your mindset in everything that you do in the green industry, from the start of your career to the end of your career. You're going to be in much better shape than where we're at right now in the green industry. All right. Next question, what do you feel the implications in Texas for Proposition 6? You know what? Good. Let me get off on a little bit of a tangent here. We've been talking about the economy and the impacts the economy has. There's one single thing that's going to have a bigger impact than anything else that our sector of the economy is going to go through, and that's water. And if we don't come up with some water policy that is beneficial for it, well, what's the word I'm looking for? Not fair, but to allocate scarce resources in its most efficient manner, we're going to be in big trouble. And our industry, you remember, right now we're considered to be a luxury industry, and people have to make a decision about whether to drink water to survive or put the water on a plant. Which one's going to be? Which one are they going to choose? So we got to come up with some water policies there. Do you see any new opportunities for small growers? Absolutely. That's our industry is very fragmented. Always has been fragmented. We've had a bipolar structure. We've had a lot of small mom and pop operations. We've had medium-sized operations, and we've had large corporate type of entities in our industry. The merger and acquisition and the shakeout has been mostly on the medium-sized folks. and those that may not have enough economies of scale to have the the lowest cost production or lowest cost operating cost. So there's always room for those smaller entities that are quick, nimble, and able to take advantage of market opportunities. All right, so one person just wrote in, obviously a Sealy conference this year. It's in Chicago in June. Their focus is going to be entirely on this water issue. So someone's following up on my water comment earlier, saying that the Sealy conference this year, that's all the discussion will be, is what should be the green industry's stance on water. So that's a good viewpoint here. All right. Are you confident that as the economy gets stronger, the Fed and the government are going to be able to react fast enough to prevent new problems? No way. Turning the government is like turning a glacier. You do it incrementally, and we're not known for our nimbleness. In fact, if you look at the number of bills that are submitted in Congress relative to the ones that get passed, I mean, it's like 1% of the bills that are introduced ever gets passed into law. So we got a terribly cumbersome system. We have a terribly bureaucratic system. But you know what? It's a system that works because we prevent a lot of knee-jerk reactions with our system. So yeah, we get frustrated, and frustrations are at an all-time level right now. People just can't stand this gridlock that we've got. But it's part of our system, and it's part of what makes this country great. So I'm going to take the high road there and say, no, they're not going to. Now, I am optimistic about the Federal Reserve and the role that they've traditionally played. Most people give Bernanke a B on his performance over the last 8 years. Crap, I'd give him an A. Truly, it's been circumstances we've never seen in this country, and he's kept us out of the water. All right, another question. Man, they're rolling in here, so I'm going to answer a couple more questions, and then we'll cut it off. Oversupply of product has been a major problem we've faced. How do you think oversupply has been reduced? Well, it depends on the sector. In the bedding plant and the tree sector, we've cut out a lot of those oversupply problems. But you can ramp up on the bedding plants in a hurry. So we're likely to get into some of the same situations with the caveat that a lot of it depends on consolidation. On the tree sector side, the poor tree growers, they got hit over the head worse than anybody else I can think of in the green industry during the recession. But right now, there's a shortage of 1.5 to 2 inch trees in some varieties. So the tree growers may actually start making some money over the next 5 years, making enough money to make it worthwhile to grow trees finally. So oversupply of product is we've cleared out a lot of that glut. But we're still an agricultural-based industry, and that whole cobweb theorem that we studied in economics and how this market works is still at play. And we're going to, when we start making money again, we're going to start seeing more production. That's just the nature of our industry, and unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, there may be fewer players out there, so the problem may be less pronounced. All right. Any comment about tropical foliage purchases by consumers? Yep, I got a comment there. You sell clean air machines. What other industry besides the air industry sells oxygen? The whole green industry, flower shrubs and trees, we sell oxygen machines. But particularly for the houseplant industry, with the new research that's bolstered some of the previous research on the reduction of volatile organic compounds. My colleague Bodhi Panisi over in Georgia, a lot of her research has shown that volatile organic compounds are scrubbed significantly in the interior of office buildings, schools, etc., with the presence of foliage plants in particular. So that particular industry should be all over that promotion aspect. And then there was just, I think I saw in my friend Marvin Miller's column the other day talking about the productivity increases in the office from, again, having foliage plants and desk plants. The NASA study years ago proved that, and we've seen bits and pieces, but we've got some new research that should revitalize and generate a lot of interest on the part of foliage growers. All right, next question. Do you see the new laws around recreational marijuana as a potential opportunity for the green industry? Absolutely. Absolutely. From an economic standpoint, the war on drugs that we've been in for, I don't know, the last 2.5 decades is ridiculous. We've not made very many inroads, and all we've done is spent a lot of money and incarcerated all. Most of the people in prison now are in there for drug-related charges, and a lot of that marijuana. So we've got antiquated laws in that regard. Now, you talk about the moral implications. All that is aside. I'm just simply talking economics here. There is definitely an opportunity for our industry because we're the green industry, and we know how to grow good quality, and we know how to adhere to either USDA standards or otherwise. So yeah, I do see it as an opportunity. Do you see a decrease in customer traffic at big box retailers and increase at local garden centers due to poor customer service for 2014? You know what? All those increases that I just showed for the Lowe's Depot and Walmart markets are in spite of the lack of service, perceived service in those venues. So I don't think the average citizen knows quite the difference. And until we get to the point where they are educated, it's like beating your head against the wall. So IGC versus box store, no, I don't. IGCs out there, you got to put your best foot forward. You got to talk about quality, price, service, convenience, and selection. And you talk about how you're different and what the value proposition associated with that difference, you're going to be just fine. If you don't, if you try to play the same game, you're going to end up just like in many other garden centers. In my mind, about 20%. Now, we've got a new survey going out this year. We being some ag economic and horticultural colleagues around the country, we do a national nursery survey, and that's going to be or a national green industry survey, and that's going to be hitting the streets here shortly. And so we're finally going to be able to quantify how many people have exited the industry and what the structural changes have been. So stay tuned with that. All right, please repeat the location for the slides in the recording. Here this is. And if you go to ellisonchair.tamu.edu, you've got all these buttons on the side. Just click on multimedia. I have a yellow box there. Just click on multimedia, click on webinars, and all of them are listed here. So you'll see the recording and you'll see the slides. And if there's questions that I've missed, I'll try to go back and provide an answer to those questions in there as well. So we've gone 1 minute and 98 seconds. We've gone a couple minutes over. I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you staying in. Again, you make this webinar series possible. So let me remind you that you're going to be directed to the quick evaluation. Please, if you will, just take a few seconds to complete that. And stay tuned for the next webinar in our webinar series. Those announcements will be out shortly. So thanks again. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next time.